Today is a week since Stanislaus Lordoswami was born again in the life of this country as Father Stan, but only after the state killed him, breaking us all. And he was not alone. Lingaram Azad, who refused to let dacoits dig his forest, is trapped for 500 days. Hidme Markam, she of the Koya people, who knew that mountains are sacred and not police officials, is also away. She remains trapped so that we know that what the regime would like us to forget. Mountains and rivers and farms that are sacred and not the state. It has been years, or so it feels, that our best poets, lawyers, academics, and conscience keepers have been locked away. Varavara Rao, Anand Teltumde, Sudha, Gautam, Surendra Gadling the forever bard, always defending those who sing. Miran Haider, Safwat, Shifaur Rahman, Fahad, Aisha, and many, many others in AMU, BHU, Jamia. When we last counted, it was more than 30 universities across the country. That's so many revolutionaries lost. And in the absence of the many Sharjils as well, that's so many fiery chai sessions that have not taken place. And that is because such conversations take place when this country, it has always had a different breed of chaiwalas. Now we are missing them both. And many are logged in our minds too. It has been long since many of us are away in Kashmir, in Punjab, in Chhattisgarh, in the land of our forests, rivers, our casteed villages and ghettoed cities. It has been years since so many of our collectives were banned, their rich politics of dissent sucked out by law. And somehow, while it has all remained democratic, we have a counter-revolution, resurrecting the origins of all oppression that lies in caste and in patriarchy, that itself lies in the races and religions of men. Throughout all of this, we, the Innocence Network, has not been able to do anything. But we have waited and called all who were taken by their names. We have scribbled them in petitions to whoever we could, and we have shouted their names on the street. And we have said, look, this is wrong. It has been so long since all of these people were away that the Delhi High Court order of Natasha Devangna and Asif feels like a breath of fresh air. It says something about our time, that when the basic idea of law is articulated, the difference between law and order and national security, that too by a high court, it feels like an act of supreme resistance. That the order of the UP High Court telling the police what comes under National Security Act looks like an act of great courage. And it is also, and it will be singled out for punishment. However long it has been, we cannot forget the clenched fist of Khalid Sefi and the mad fervor in his eyes that escaped even in that one moment when he walked out from the police car into the court. In that one moment, even surrounded by all the media that has turned a different direction, they couldn't stop his fervor from reaching us. And however long it has been, it is quite clear that what we hear now as national security, as national interest, and all that hides under it, is not the interest of we the people or the interest of our citizens. How then to think through our citizenship, our liberties, how to look at this massive machinery that is taking away all meaning from us? To advise and nurture us, we have three of the best people who've spent their lives, many years longer than this regime, nurturing freedoms, training their eyes on this state. We have Manisha Sethi, who has walked with us on the idea of innocence and on so many other things for so long. a documenter of crimes of terrorism. She's now a professor at NALSA. We also have our special guest here, Professor Veena Das, who's going to draw from her vast reserves of knowledge and insights. One of the most renowned anthropologists in the world, she has been a giver of meanings and of ways to look at ourselves in this state. And today we expect no less. And we have Usha Ramanathan, silent crusader and elder of the many civil liberties movement in India. Be it protecting our privacy or our rights to speak or rights to just remain human from anything that seeks to take it away. We are very happy that we are here and conversing. I'm not qualified to moderate this panel, so I'll just lay it out right now. We'll first have Manisha speak on the crisis of democracy. Then we have Professor Das on the state's torture, read widely, and Usha on how we bring liberties back. But before we begin, I would like to call Abdul Wahid Sheikh, the author of Beguna Kaidi. While many remain in prisons today, who we remember, we also meet to celebrate Wahid Sheikh's long years of human rights crusade, both within prison and outside of it. And now it's also in the form of a book. And we also remember so many people who remain wrongfully incarcerated inside prisons, especially the 7/11 case too. So Wahid Bhai, if you could please show us your book and we could release it by raising our fists in solidarity.
हेलो, मेरे पास इस वक्त आवाज आ रही है मेरी शारिफ भाई? मेरे पास इस वक्त बुक नहीं है क्योंकि मैं तो ये सोच रहा था कि वीना मैडम के हाथों उसका इनॉग्रेशन है, तो अब मैं बुक लेके जहाँ मैं बैठा हूँ वहाँ पर तो बुक नहीं है, शायद थोड़ी देर में आ जाएगी, तो मैं आपको दिखाता हूँ। वीना मैडम अगर इनॉग्रेट कर दे तो अच्छा रहेगा।
Sure. मैं वाहिद भाई आप, लेकिन आप उस पे कुछ बोले, आपको सुनने बहुत लोग आए हैं। मैं जरूर किताब में इनॉग्रेट कर देती हूँ क्योंकि उससे मैंने इतना सीखा है कि आपके ऑनर में मैं उसको आई एम रियली वेरी प्रिविलेज्ड टू inaugurate it, and I'm going to take this thing on it. So वो मैं उतने इसकी रस्म रिवाज ज्यादा जानती नहीं हूँ, उसके लिए माफी मांगती हूँ आपसे। तो ये देखिए, इंग्लिश में इनोसेंट प्रिजनर्स आ गई है, और आप अपने सब फिस्ट रेज करिए जो इतने जिन्हें हैं। इसके इसकी अहमियत जो है वो बरसों लोग इसको पढ़ेंगे और आपकी इस बात को एडमायर करेंगे कि आपने इतनी हिम्मत, और इतनी हिम्मत ही सिर्फ नहीं, और इतनी कूल तरीके से आपने जो एनालिसिस करे हैं, उसका हम सब बहुत बहुत आभारी हैं आपके।
शुक्रिया मैडम, शुक्रिया, बहुत ज़्यादा शुक्रिया। ये मेरे लिए प्रिविलेज की बात है और मेरे लिए खुशी की बात है कि ये बुक आपके हाथों से, इसका इंग्लिश एडिशन का जो है इनॉग्रेशन हो रहा है, वरना मैं तो एक कैदी हूँ और बहुत छोटा आदमी हूँ। थैंक यू।
मैं ये भी कह दूं कि मेरी अगली किताब जो है, आपसे इतना सीखा, तो स्लम एक्ट्स करके जो मैं अगली किताब इस साल निकलने वाली है, वो वाहिद भाई को ही डेडिकेटेड है, क्योंकि उनके बिना मैं इस बारे में ठीक से सोच नहीं पा रही थी।
थैंक यू वेरी मच, बहुत शुक्रिया मैडम। शारिफ भाई आप प्रोसीड कीजिए या मैं पहले बात रख दूं?
वाहिद भाई आप कुछ रखें जी।
वाहिद भाई आप थोड़ा जोर से बोलेंगे?
हाँ, मैं जोर से बोलूंगा।
हाँ, थोड़ा और जोर से बोलिएगा जी। हाँ, अब ठीक है।
हेलो एवरीवन, गुड इवनिंग, सलाम। बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया आज के इस वेबिनार को अटेंड करने के लिए। और 3 एक बड़े मेहमान हमारे दरमियान मौजूद है जो इस टॉपिक पर, वेरियस टॉपिक पर बात रखेंगे। चूँकि अभी मेरी बुक का जो है इनॉग्रेशन हुआ है बीना दास मैडम के हाथों, और मुझे ये कहा गया है कि कुछ इस बुक पर मैं बोलूं, तो मैंने इस बुक पर और हमारे केस पर पिछले 6 सालों से बहुत कुछ बोला है। कभी कभी ऐसा लगता है कि मैं बोलते बोलते थक गया हूँ और वही सारी चीज़ें रिपीट करते करते कभी कभी इरिटेट की कैफियत हो जाती है। लेकिन मैं इस बोलने को सिर्फ बोलना नहीं समझता हूँ, बल्कि मैं ये समझता हूँ कि ये एक मिशन है जिसके तहत मैं ये बोलता हूँ। और ये मेरा मिशन उस वक्त तक ख़त्म नहीं होगा जब तक कि जिस मकसद के लिए मैं बोल रहा हूँ वो मकसद पूरा नहीं हो जाता। और मेरा मकसद ये है कि कम से कम इस केस में जो लोग फंसे हुए हैं, जो 12 बेगुनाह है, जो इनोसेंट है, और मैं बार बार ये कहता हूँ कि वो मुझसे ज़्यादा इनोसेंट है, वो जब तक रिलीज़ नहीं हो जाते तो मैं ये बात कहता रहूँगा और थकता रहूँगा, लेकिन मैं इसको कहना बंद नहीं करूँगा। आप जानते हैं कि 2014 में ये बुक मैंने जेल में लिखी थी, और जेल में आप जानते हैं अंडा सेल होता है और बहुत ही सॉलिटरी कन्फाइनमेंट होता है, बहुत स्ट्रेस होता है, टेंशन होता है। लेकिन उस पीरियड में भी मुझे ये बुक लिखने के लिए एक बात ने मजबूर किया, क्योंकि हमारा जजमेंट उस वक्त आने वाला था और मैं नहीं जानता था कि हमारा जजमेंट क्या आएगा और कोर्ट हमारे किस्मत का फैसला क्या करेगा और मेरे साथ क्या करेगा। लेकिन मुझे मेरे दिल में एक बात ये थी कि मैं इस केस के बारे में लिखूं, ताकि हम जिए या मरे, हम कैद में रहे या आज़ाद रहे, इस केस की सच्चाई और जो पुलिस और एटीएस और इन्वेस्टिगेशन एजेंसीज की जो सच्चाई है, और हिंदुस्तान के अंदर टेररिज्म के नाम पर जो तमाशा हो रहा है, किस तरह से एक्यूज को टॉर्चर किया जाता है, किस तरह से उसके खिलाफ जो है एविडेंस बनाए जाते हैं, ये सारी सच्चाई जो हमारे ऊपर गुजरी थी, मैं चाहता था कि ये दुनिया वालों तक किसी तरह पहुंचे। तो मैंने ये जेल के अंदर बैठकर किताब लिखी। मुझे नहीं पता था कि मैं इसको कैसे जेल के बाहर पहुंचाऊंगा, मुझे नहीं पता था कि ये जेल के बाहर जाकर के कैसे छपेगी, कब छपेगी। लेकिन एक मकसद के तहत मैंने इसको लिखा और बाहर भेजा। और उस वक्त 2015 में एक मिरेकल हो गया मेरे साथ कि जज ने मुझे छोड़ दिया और मैं बाहर आ गया। और उसके बाद जो है डॉक्टर जफरुल इस्लाम खान साहब से कांटेक्ट हुआ और उन्होंने इस बुक को जो है प्रिंट किया, पहले उर्दू में, फिर हिंदी में, फिर अंग्रेजी में, अभी कई लैंग्वेजेस में ये आने वाली है। तो ये बुक जो है बेसिकली ये मेरी बायोग्राफी नहीं है, ये सिर्फ मेरी हमदर्दी बटोरने के लिए लिखी गई किताब नहीं है। ये एक ऐसी बुक है जिसमें बहुत से नौजवानों की दास्तान है, उनके बारे में बताया गया है। और ये बताया गया है कि किस तरह से दहशतगर्दी के नाम पर, वॉर ऑन टेररिज्म के नाम पर, यहाँ पर इंडिया में जो है माइनॉरिटी के साथ, खासतौर से मुसलमानों के साथ जो खेल हो रहा है उसको बताया गया है। अभी पिछले हफ्ते जो इस केस का एक एक्यूज है, मोहम्मद माजिद मोहम्मद शफी, उसकी वाइफ जो है उसका इंतकाल हो गया था, उसको जो है कैंसर हो गया, मर गई। लेकिन कोर्ट ने उसको जो है पैरोल नहीं दिया और उसकी पैरोल रिजेक्ट हो गई। वो आज मुझसे बात कर रहा था, बहुत ज़्यादा रो रहा था और वो अपनी दाढ़ी दिखा रहा था मुझे और कह रहा था कि हमारी दाढ़ी काली थी कल, आज हमारी दाढ़ी सफ़ेद हो गई है और हम बेगुनाह होने के बावजूद पिछले 15 सालों से जेल में बंद है। तो वो मुझसे एक सवाल कर रहा था कि हम कब छूटेंगे। वो हंस हंस के ये बात कह रहा था और मैं हंस के जवाब दे रहा था, लेकिन मैं समझ रहा था कि वो अपने दिल के अंदर कितना जो है उदास है और कितना रो रहा है। क्योंकि देखिए, एक जो बेगुनाह है वो अगर जेल में रहता है तो कितना उसको दर्द होता है। आज मैं एक रिपोर्ट देख रहा था फेसबुक पर, कहा गया कि उमर खालिद को 300 दिन हो गए, सैफुल्लाह को जो है 100 दिन हो गए, फला साहब को जो है 200 दिन हो गए। नो डाउट 300 दिन, 100 दिन जो बेगुनाह जेलों में है वो तकलीफ में है, सही बात है। लेकिन आपको सुन के हैरत होगी कि इस केस में जो लोग बंद है उनको 5,475 दिन हो गए। 5,475 दिन, यानी पिछले 15 सालों से वो जेल में है, और एक ही होप है उनको कि किसी तरह से वो इस केस से जो है बाइज्जत बरी होकर आ जाए। इस केस के अंदर जो इरेगुलरिटीज हुई है, जो गलत काम हुए हैं, वो बहुत सारे हैं जो मैंने किताब में लिखे हैं। पिछले 6 साल से बॉम्बे हाई कोर्ट के अंदर ये केस पेंडिंग है, इसकी सुनवाई नहीं हो रही है, और कोई जज इसको सुनने के लिए तैयार नहीं है, कोई जज इसको प्रायोरिटी बेसिस पे लेने के लिए तैयार नहीं है, और ये डिले पर डिले हो रहा है, जिसकी वजह से ये सारे लोग कैद है और अपनी रिहाई का इंतजार कर रहे हैं। बहुत से जो इसमें कैदी है उनकी नई नई शादी हुई थी, उनके घर में बच्चे नहीं हुए थे, बच्चा उनके पेट में था, उनकी बीवी के पेट में था। जेल जाने के बाद उनके घर पे जो है बच्चे हुए, डिलीवरी हुई, और आज वो बच्चे इतने बड़े हो गए कि वो शादी के लायक हो गए, लेकिन इनको इंसाफ नहीं मिला। तो सामाइन जो मेरी बात सुन रहे हैं और आगे भी इसको सुना जाएगा, मैं बहुत ही दर्दमंदी के साथ और बहुत ही उम्मीद के साथ ये बात हर जगह पे कहता हूँ, इस वक्त भी कह रहा हूँ कि जब तक के इन बच्चों को, इन लड़कों को इंसाफ नहीं मिलेगा, तब तक के जो है शांति कायम सही मानों में नहीं हो सकती। आप सिर्फ मजहब के नाम पर और इस्लाम के नाम पर और जो है आइडेंटिटी के नाम पर अगर किसी को टारगेट करेंगे और उसको जेलों में फंसाएंगे सालों साल के लिए, तो ये अच्छी चीज़ नहीं है, इसको बंद होना चाहिए। और पूरी दुनिया के अंदर जो है अभी सिनेरियो चेंज हो रहा है, इंसाफ की लहर दिखाई दे रही है कहीं कहीं जगह पर, तो यहाँ पर इंसाफ होना चाहिए। और ये डिस्प्यूटेड केस ऐसा नहीं है कि मेरा डिस्प्यूट किया हुआ है या मैं आपको कह रहा हूँ कि ये केस बोगस है, ये तो डिस्प्यूट विद इन द पुलिस है। एटीएस की स्टोरी अलग है, क्राइम ब्रांच की स्टोरी अलग है, एनआईए की स्टोरी अलग है। तो एक ऐसा केस है जो पुलिस डिपार्टमेंट के अंदर सबसे ज्यादा डिस्प्यूटेड है, लेकिन अदालत में ये डिस्प्यूटेड नहीं है, और अदालत इसमें जो है वन साइडेड जो है जजमेंट दे देता है, और मैक्सिमम पनिशमेंट 13 में से 12 लोगों को दे देता है, और मैक्सिमम मैक्सिमम कन्विक्शन 13 में से 12 को कन्विक्ट करते के साथ साथ 5 लोगों को फांसी की सजा दी जाती है। ये बहुत ज्यादा जुल्म और बहुत ज्यादा जो है जब्र की बात है। 93 का जो ब्लास्ट हुआ था उसमें भी इतनी फांसियां नहीं हुई है, इस केस में फांसियां हुई है, जो कि बहुत ही डिस्प्यूटेड केस है। तो मैं ज्यादा वक्त नहीं लेना चाहता, चूंकि मुझे शारिफ भाई ने कहा था कि आप अपनी बुक को कैमरे के सामने दिखाइए, तो मैं उसको, मेरे पास बुक अभी आ गई है, मैंने मंगा लिया था घर से, तो मैं वो बुक भी दिखा देता हूँ। लेकिन मैं आप लोगों से ज़रूर एक अपील करूँगा कि इस केस के लिए जो भी हम कर सकते हैं, कोई अगर लेक्चर दे सकता है, कोई आर्टिकल लिख सकता है, कोई कोई वकील प्रो बोनो केस लड़ सकता है, कोई जो है इसके लिए कैंपेन चला सकता है, कोई इसके लिए हम कहीं पर प्रोटेस्ट कर सकते हैं, कोई इसके लिए हम एक डेलीगेशन लेके अथॉरिटी से मिल सकते हैं, या जो कुछ हम पॉसिबल वे में हम कर सकते हैं वो हमको करना चाहिए। ये हम सब की जिम्मेदारी है। अगर इस केस में इंसाफ मिलेगा तो सही मानों में सबके साथ केस टेरर के नाम पर जो गलत हो रहा है उसमें इंसाफ होगा, क्योंकि हिंदुस्तान में सबसे बड़ा टेरर केस इस वक्त यही है। और जो स्टूडेंट इस्लामिक मूवमेंट ऑफ इंडिया को पर जो बैन लगाया गया है, जो सिमी पे बैन लगाया गया है, और जो एटीएस का ये कहना है कि ये 13 एक्यूज सिमी से रिलेटेड लोग हैं, और सिमी पर 2001 से जो बैन लगाया गया है, सुप्रीम कोर्ट में सिमी बैन को जो चैलेंज किया गया है उसमें सबसे बड़ा केस इसी को जो है गवर्नमेंट ने पुटअप किया है कि देखिए ये सिमी के लोग हैं, ये जो ब्लास्ट करते हैं और ये कन्विक्शन इनको मिला है, इसलिए सिमी पर से बैन नहीं हटाया जाना चाहिए। तो एक गलत बैन लगाया गया, और एक गलत बैन को साबित करने के लिए एक गलत केस में लोगों को फंसा करके गलत सजाएं दी गई है। तो ये जुल्म के ऊपर जुल्म और जब्र के ऊपर जब्र हो रहा है, इसको बंद होना चाहिए। तो मैं शारिफ भाई के कहने पर अपनी बुक पे जो है मैडम ने इनॉग्रेट किया है, मैं उसको दिखा देता हूँ और मैं अपनी बात यहीं पे ख़त्म करता हूँ। और उम्मीद करता हूं कि तमाम लोगों को मेरी बात मैं समझाने में या अपनी बात रखने में मैं कामयाब रहा हूँगा। और जो हमारे दीगर जो स्पीकर्स है मैं उनका ज़्यादा वक्त ना लूँगा और मैं उनको मौका देता हूँ कि वो अपनी बात रखें। मैं अपनी बात यहीं ख़त्म करता हूँ। आप लोगों ने मेरी बातों को खामोशी से और सुना और समझा, मैं उसके लिए आपका शुक्रगुजार हूँ। शुक्रिया। शारिफ भाई।
Thank you, Wahid bhai. Many of us who are here, we know how terror laws have been used against certain people, and they've been used against others before, and they will be used against so many later on. And everybody, at the center of it is the question of terror laws, as how certain instruments through law are used to take away rights of people, to deprive of what they are trying to say, even if it's something very different. So now, Manisha, we are ready for you.
Can you hear me, Sharif? Okay. So Wahid, Sharif, Professor Das, Usha, and other friends and comrades who are here, good evening and adab to everyone. And so Sharif said that I must speak on crisis of democracy, but I think I will approach it through the vantage of anti-terror laws and how they work. And that itself will kind of illustrate the ways in which all our institutions are being pulverized, and in a way, there's certain kind of perverseness at the heart of these institutions. I think many of these cases will show that. But first of all, I think वाहिद बहुत मुबारक किताब का जो अंग्रेजी तर्जुमा है उसके लिए मुबारकबाद भी कहना अजीब लगता है, क्योंकि I'm sure वाहिद hoped that he would never have to write such a book, but now that he has written, I think it's a document, as Professor Das says, which generations will read and will gain insight from, about the way in which the sheer pettiness with which the law works and grinds you down into earth, really. Anybody who comes under these mighty wheels of the law, how it's sort of ground into dust. And but I'll start with why this touched upon it, and Professor Das is going to speak about the case at length. I just want to quickly just kind of skim over it and to enter into what I want to say, because I think this case illustrates brilliantly in many ways what is wrong with all the institutions or all the arms of criminal justice system, whether it is the investigating agencies, whether it is the prosecution, whether it is the judiciary, or whether it is the fourth pillar, the media. So from the start, the way in which these sort of sensational claims were made in the press conferences, saying that we've cracked the case, first giving some other names, and then a week later the names of these the present set of accused who were then picked up one by one. 13 people picked up over a period of a month, and so to the judiciary, which looked the other way when the marks of torture were very much evident in front of them in the court appearances, denying bail, denying all kinds of all the applications, everything. And I hope that those who are here will read the book and they will see for themselves how every single application that the accused filed was turned down, and every single application that the prosecution filed was granted. So the way in which the judiciary worked, culminating finally, of course, with the conviction of, except for Wahid, everybody else was convicted. And as Wahid says, the largest number of hangings, death sentences in a single case. The way in which, of course, the prosecution works, I mean, we all know how the prosecution works, but I mean, it still takes your breath away when you actually see the way in which, the false affidavits are being filed, the way, just to get remands and so on. So, and the way in which evidence which would have contradicted the case is kind of hidden away and so on. And then, of course, the way in which the media, very pliant media, which froths at the mouth in the name of national security, creates this whole narrative of guilt even before charge sheets have been filed. They've proclaimed if they had their way, they would have executed everybody even before the trial. So it kind of points to the way this case is really a very good illustration of the way in which, every single institution failed the accused, and failed justice in a way, right? Now, to touch upon two brief points, the whole case hinged on, I know I have to finish in 20 minutes and I will, but I just want to point to a couple of things, which is that the whole case hinged on these call detail records. And in fact, 5 remand applications were filed, through these months, through the early months, from July onwards to September, 5 remand applications were filed, and they're almost unbroken police custody for Wahid and other accused in the case, almost like 2.5 months or possibly 3 months of police custody. And every single remand application was accepted, granted by the courts. And what was this? I mean, why? And this whole exercise was done on the grounds that the police has these call detailed records, and they have proof of these accused being in touch with the SIMI, being in touch with ISI in Pakistan, and being their puppets and so on. So this whole narrative was built all along in the remand applications and very dutifully reproduced in the popular in media and news media, right? Now and Professor Das is going to talk about it and what happened during this period, the very devices of cruelty that, in the torture chambers of the ATS and so on. And why were these remands necessary? In order to extract confessions, because really at the end of the day, the CDRs did not find their way into the charge sheet. And it was only these confessions which then become the entire core of the judgment. And there's absolutely no other material evidence which can kind of link them to the crime. It is only these confessions which were extracted under torture, which then kind of speak of the guilt of the accused in a way, right? So and so the crux of the judgment jury is these confessions. And as I said, the CDRs never found a mention in the charge sheet, right? Now, and the case was tried under MCOCA and UAPA, which is, and I want to talk a little bit about the structures of the structure of these laws as well. But the lives of people like Wahid are really, the living illustrations of, the consequences and the effects of a law like MCOCA or UAPA. Now, we are all remembering Father Stan Swamy, as we all should. But very few know that accused number 1 in this case, Kamal Ansari, has died recently in jail. He got COVID and he was, one doesn't know what sort of medical help, he got, but, and the family wasn't informed. Very typical of the way in which, the opaqueness with which the entire prison system works, right? And so the accused number 1 has died waiting for his appeal application to be heard in the High Court. And we often tend not to think of people like Kamal Ansari or even Wahid as political prisoners, because we have a very, a certain idea of what a political prisoner is, that he's, somebody who expresses dissent, through his writings or her writings, or through taking part in certain kind of political, the dissenter is, a political prisoner is a person with political agency and, talking, writing, protesting, and so on and so forth, right? But many of these people, of course, we've seen over the years that many people who've been arrested in these terror cases have some links with SIMI, right? And SIMI as an organization, which the government is saying is unlawful and so on. So we'll come to that point in just a bit, right? But many, in fact, a large proportion of people who are being charged under UAPA or even MCOCA in Maharashtra, for example, are people who have had no links at all with any organization. They just happened, they were not remotely, linked with SIMI or any political project of any nature, right? They just simply happened to fall in a certain demographic. They belonged to, a certain age group. They belonged to, they were Muslims, basically, right? So we tend not to think of this category of people who've been arrested and charged under UAPA as political prisoners, but I think we should, because it is a political project which, under which they've been arrested, which is to cast, this whole nation state, the whole question of national security, and in fact, who is the other of this nation state, which is, these Muslims, these, during the Tada years, it was the Sikhs, right? and of course, these laws, when we look at them, they've been used against a whole range of people, dissenters and so on. But the whole project of nation state, which is kind of implicit and inherent in anti-terror laws, and which allows for the othering of, these people, of these categories of people. And so I think it's a political project. And so therefore, rightly, we should think of, these prisoners as political prisoners. Now, I just do want to speak a little bit about, the structure of the anti-terror laws, or the nature, because often, the question when one is speaking, and I, like Wahid, I'm also feeling very jaded at having to speak about these anti-terror laws. One has been talking about it since 2008. So, and one sort of feels that, what is the point really after, after a point that, but I think when we started in 2008 up till now, there is much greater, for example, when we were talking about it in the early days, just after the Butler House encounter, when we started kind of documenting many of these terror cases, people even from so-called, progressive liberal circles would say, but there's no smoke without fire, and so there must be some connection, and it can't be all, this whole, national security being such a holy cow, there was very little questioning around this. But I think now, by the sheer, there is a certain stripping of that, stripping away of that sort of facade, I think, at least amongst the, the liberal set, if not otherwise, right? Now, so what do anti-terror laws do, and and why are we saying that there is a certain link with the, with the perversion of democratic norms and so on? So now, if you look at the structure of these anti-terror laws, on the one hand, you have, and one is, of course, the current anti-terror law is the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, though you have some state acts as well as, MACOCA, and then, Gujarat has recently passed GUJCOCA after a lot of back and forth over a long period of time. Now, on the one hand, what you find is that there is a great deal of imprecision or ambiguity in terms of definitions. So, who is a terrorist? How do these laws define terror, terror act, terrorist gang, and so on and so forth, right? So there is a this is a very slippery slope. It's all very vague, and, it's kind of imprecise, which allows the state to subjectively then interpret what it means and to fill in these categories, through whatever its subjective predilections or biases, right? So on the one hand, you have these ambiguities of definition, and on the other hand, you have a very hard and ossified structure in terms of, once you're in, the impossibility of bail, for example. It's just simply impossible. As Wahid was saying, an accused, there's a bereavement in the family and you will not get bail, right? And I say that, and it's not simply just the anti-terror laws which have this, that any attachment to the idea of terrorism can result in that. For example, Amir Khan, who was in jail for 14 years, when he was, charged and incarcerated, there was no anti-terror law at the moment, right? But the sheer fact that he had been, so he was tried under, IPC and so on, but the fact that the charge was of, connected to bomb blasts and terrorism and so on, meant that even when his father passed away and his mother needed, medical support and help, he could not get bail, right? So the whiff of terrorism and, can kind of pervert any idea of, fair trial and so on. So, so on the one hand, these very ambiguous definitions of which people just, I have 5 minutes, Sharif? 5, 7 minutes?
Yes, please, no, Manisha, you take your time.
Okay. So, and on the other hand, these very sort of hard structures which allow very little, maneuvering space, or as one could possibly say, very little possibilities of judicial sort of interpretive exercises. Now, so what this results in is, perforce a kind of limitation of liberty. It is likely, so often if you're speaking to young, law students and so on, so they would say, what is the problem? Is the law the problem, or is the application, are it just these horrible police officers who put them, in jail and tortured them and so on? The problem is that the structure of the law, the architecture of the whole, the law is like that. And it is bound to result in, the limitation of liberties, and it's going to strike down on our freedoms and, just the right to life. And right? Now, if we look at the legacy, because, I think the past few days, because of Father Stan Swami's, death, the whole discussion around Bhima Koregaon, as well as the bail, the bail order of Devangana and others, the Delhi High Court, there has been a large, in fact, this discussion has been going on for the last 2-3 years now. I think ever since the whole anti-CA protesters were arrested, as well as the Bhima Koregaon, there's been a lot of public discussion around UAPA, which was not there at least 3-4 years ago. Now there is much greater public discussion around that. So if you were to look at the legacy of Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, there are really two streams which kind of feed into the making of the present UAPA. One is that comes from a very, sort of colonial legacy, which is, the Criminal Law Amendment of 1908, under which law the British banned many organizations, including the Congress Party. So the CLA of 1908, which kind of continued into the post-independence India, but which was struck down by the Supreme Court later on in V.G. Rao case. Now, the UAPA is enacted. So what the CLA tried to do was to ban organizations by saying, that you cannot, these organizations are committing treason or sedition or, anti-nationals and so on and so forth. So you cannot, these organizations would be banned, right? But V.G. Rao case, the court said, no, you can't just ban. The Constitution provides the right to association, so that is kind of inviolable, and you can't just through an executive fiat ban an organization. The organization has to have a chance to, respond to your accusations and so on. Now, but what happened immediately after that was, you have the Indochina skirmishes, then you have the Indo-Pakistan war. And so you have a very long period of internal emergencies, starting from 62, 63, up till 1967. So you have these two internal emergencies during which period, in fact, again, another colonial piece of legislation, which is the Defense of India Act, is sort of brought back into life. And, right to fair trial is taken away, right to form associations is taken away. And it is under this, we also have this horrible history of interning Chinese, people of Chinese origin during this period under the Defense of India Act. So you have, through this period, you have these, many of the fundamental liberties that Constitution provides being taken away, right? And it is at the end of this period, in fact, that the UAPA is brought in and tabled in the parliament, right? So the fear of, the taking away of the powers that the executive had enjoyed during the emergency, that kind of spurred the bringing in of UAPA, where again, even though in the V.G. Rao case, the court had explicitly stated that, the right to association is a fundamental right and cannot be taken away. A new category called unlawful activity is created, through this piece of legislation. And in fact, this is the first time that you have such a category of crime, which is unlawful activity. Now, as Wahid was saying, you had a series of, starting from 2001, SIMI was banned under UAPA. And as Wahid was rightly pointing out, that one of the big cases that the Home Ministry has cited in the Supreme Court, and in fact, it does routinely in these high court, because under UAPA, you can ban an organization, right? But because the V.G. Rao judgment said that you must give the organization a chance to kind of answer your accusations before you do so, there is always a tribunal which is conducted. Now, in this tribunal, Home Ministries, the Central Home Ministry, as well as Home Ministries of different state governments, will present affidavits and say, oh, but SIMI activities are going on, and so therefore you need to ban SIMI. And so this is a kind of a symbiosis which continues. And so, because Simi is banned, you are able to file cases against people saying that, oh, these are members of Simi or they're furthering Simi activities. And because they are arrested, you can kind of continue to validate your need, so-called, to ban an organization like Simi. So there is this kind of symbiosis that continues. And as I was saying, the definition of unlawful is so vague. It is so vague that practically everything, this Zoom meeting possibly could be lumped under the category of unlawful. I mean, this could well be, right? I mean, this is a very fit case actually, but even otherwise, even very innocuous meetings of film clubs and so on could be labeled as unlawful, because anything, it says that anything by word, by speech, by sign, by so a painting or song, anything. In fact, in the Bhima Koregaon case, the charge sheet in fact mentions the songs that are being sung by people on the stage in Elgar Parishad celebrations. So the definition is so wide and so subjective that it just allows the state, it gives the state so much power to define who it wants to put in that basket of unlawfulness and who it doesn't really. Similarly, so this is one stream of unlawfulness which defines or UAPA, but there's another stream which comes from laws like TADA and POTA, which were explicitly to do with terrorism. UAPA was never originally meant for terrorism; it was meant for unlawful activities, right? So now you have these new definitions of these categories of terrorist act, terrorist gang, raising funds for terrorist activities, etc., were introduced through these laws. And again, we know that bail provisions were very stringent, and people spent years in jail without even the trial starting. And in fact, the conviction rates for both TADA and POTA were abysmally low. They were sometimes less than 2% in many cases. But people spent years, and that sustained this whole, because people were being arrested and sent to jail. And reporting was no better in those times, but it kind of created the illusion that there was this whole, enemy of the state out there trying to, shake the foundations of our country, and so therefore, the need for continuation of such a law. Now, the current, for example, all these people who've been anti-CA protesters in Delhi who have been charged under UAPA, the most mightiest weapon of the state has been deployed against them. They've been charged under various sections of UAPA, not just 3, 10, 13, which are to do with unlawful activities, but also 16, 17, 18, which are to do with terrorist acts. And the definitions of terrorism again come from TADA and POTA and remain as vague and imprecise as ever. So a terrorist activity, me knifing somebody could be a terrorist act if the prosecution says that it was done with the intent to strike terror. So the intent to strike terror is the heart of defining all of these, defining terrorism and terrorist act and so on. And again, so it could apply to anything. It could apply to a chakka jam, if the NIA or the ATS or the Delhi Special Cell says that, and which is what happened really in Delhi, right? That it was done intent to strike terror. So you have people who actually incited violence, who actually engaged in violence. The parallel is so stark, both in Bhima Koregaon case, as well as in the Delhi case. Those who actually engaged in violence have not been charged. But those who were protesting or those who were, on the streets were charged under these activities because they were apparently intending to strike terror, right? Now, I think I've overshot my time. So I just want to end with one thing, saying that, so what it allows, what the vagueness of definitions and the hardness of, so it's not as the procedure is not there, the procedure is there, but it's just, so hard and ossified that you can't really, if somebody wants to go, as Judge Tipse went, to outside of the statute and look, and I think Usha will, possibly speaking about those things, to look at the larger constitutional norms and values, then there is a certain possibility. But the statute itself is limiting. The statute, the law itself is limiting. And what it is doing is it is allowing, it is pulverizing the very notion of rule of law, any attachment to the idea of fair trial, but also what it is doing, it is allowing the marking out of enemies of the state. And, whether it is through these, bans and through by, labeling people as, terrorists and so on. And sometimes, it's both. And the enemies of the state are both. They are both the political groups who have an ideology or who are, engaged in some political work, but it can also be some, social religious categories such as the Muslim today, right? And in fact, the figure of the anti-Shia protester brings both of these together. So Umar Khalid, Safura, Miran Haider, all of these are enemies par excellence because they kind of combine both of these, sort of poles of the enemies of the state. So I think I will just end here because I'm also looking forward to hearing Professor Das and Usha. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Manisha. With that history of grief and enemy law on a Zoom call, which is a fit case for banning, we are ready for you, Professor Das.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm going to follow a slightly different line of thought, but also language. So I will give a short summary of what I'm going to say in English, but then I will switch to Hindi because I think Wahid Bhai rightly said to me that there are many people here who would like to hear what you have to say in Hindi, and I'm, neither my Hindi nor my English is particularly good. So I think it would be helpful to for me to be able to put forward, cut my presentation a bit shorter, but to bring out what the major points are that I want to say. Manisha has already covered a very vast terrain, both here and in her work, for which I'm very grateful. And I really look forward to hearing Usha, who is always kind of has this quality of absolute legal clarity on what she's saying. So the main points that I want to make is that one of the very great importance of Wahid Bhai's book is that it's actually not written in the genre of testimony at all. It is written in a genre of a pedagogical, training in a certain sense of saying, how should we look at these questions of terrorism? And there are 2 points I would make. One is, of course, the whole question of what do we understand by law over here, but also the fact that the police procedures not only target and torture the individual who they have been able to pin the label of either suspect or accused, but also that torture really fractures entire communities. It's not, it's, I think, very important to recognize that it's not some vague results of, modernity and so on that are fracturing communities today. I think it is also the very fact that the state proceeds in certain kinds of ways. So to give a very small example, in Wahid's case itself, there was this entire way of constantly calling his brother and saying, you should really tell your brother that this is how he should move. If he doesn't do this, if he doesn't confess, we are going to bring your parents in, we are going to bring his wife in. And this is very, very common in the fieldwork that I did in slum areas, for example. It was one of the most, the thing feared, which is that if the police puts pressure, like one of the women said to me that her son was taken away and then actually released because they settled on some other accused. But she said she was terrified, and he was terrified that he would not be able to withstand the threat of torture. And so he may end up giving a name, and he would know this name is of an innocent person, and that this really creates absolute ruptures and in some ways crashes the possibility of intimacy in neighborhoods, among families, among kin. This I saw even in 1984 in the riots cases or the programs against Sikhs, that it was not just the fact that there was the police, which was in complete connivance, but also that people really began to suspect their brothers, their cousins, their uncles of having given information to the rioters. So I think we need to think about this in ways in which the whole communities are in some ways fractured. And I think Wahid's book was very educative on these, because these are the kinds of things which disappear from the archival record, and therefore to reconstruct them is actually really important. Second, I think it's, Manisha's already touched on this, but it is a very important fact to think that a very large number of people are arrested and a very large number of people are released. So what's happening between the arrest and the release is really, the scene of two things are happening over there. One is that the police has to create a particular story in the case of terror laws, under the terror questions of saying this is not ordinary crime, this is not gang fights, this is a conspiracy against integrity and sovereignty. Now think about the fact that there's somebody like Tiger Menon with all his, mansions and foreign travel and so on and so forth. And then there's somebody living in a chawl who's a driver or a cleaner. How do you connect the two? How do you say that these two people would, in the normal course of life, come into contact with each other, right? And that's where I found that the police stories that are concocted over here to create this idea of conspiracy were very important. They were part, in a certain sense, of what one would call legal fictions. And here I want to say that legal fictions are different from lies. And I will say a little more on that, and I'll be happy to answer any questions on that. Legal fictions can be very important in securing justice sometimes, because, certain, say, the fact that the judge can sometimes, go beyond the strict level of evidence and be able to interpret to show that the action, his or her judgment may not be fully in accordance with the law, but it is in accordance with certain notions of justice. Here, it is actually absolute lies through which these particular connections are made. Third, I would say that the way that torture is used in this, again, it is, Wahid's book makes this absolutely clear. It completely blurs the distinction between witness and accused and suspect and somebody actually convicted. So if you're saying, and it is clear in police affidavits, they will say, we're asking for more time in police custody, so a more minute interrogation can be done, because we don't have the names of everybody who we think were involved. But this is really putting into police custody somebody who you are saying is a witness. That's his role over there, that he knows about somebody else. And we can therefore, we need to be able to do minute interrogation everywhere. I think it's understood that minute interrogation is really about torture. And lastly, I think, there are two other points, and then I will switch to Hindi. One is really that we really need to think harder on why is it that pretty respectable people, lawyers, people who were actually, some of these Ural scholars were involved with civil rights activism, like Dershowitz, are able to say that torture is justified, right? What's the structure of argument which from Walzer to Dershowitz say that torture is justified? And I argue that, it's precisely the kind of ticking bomb scenario in which a hypothetical is presented as if it was an actual, so that, it slides into the actual. So instead of if, then it becomes it is so, and therefore, torture is justified. We need to really think at every level how to contest these kinds of formulations. They point to Manisha's thing, if there is fire, there must be, if there's smoke, there must be fire. I think that structure has to be really dismantled. And lastly, I would like to say that it's not purely that torture should not be done against innocent accused. Torture should not be done against anybody, whether they are actual criminals, whether they are convicted of crime, whether they are, this is just something which we should talk in every house, every locality, every occasion, every temple, every mosque, every Friday sermon, to say that in some ways, this is what is completely corrupting in a certain sense, not only those who are affected, on whom we should give priority, no question about that. But I think about the way that torture and cruelty come to be practiced in homes against wives, the way that trafficking of little girls, where one of the way to discipline them is actually the use of rape for for little girls. And I think that we need to think whether, in a certain sense, torture is also a certain way in which naming it as torture might be an important step. I know that there would be differences of opinion on that, but I think it would be worth opening it up for discussion. So with your permission, I will move to Hindi. तो मैंने अंग्रेजी में शुरू किया है, लेकिन काफी समरी सिर्फ दी है, और अगर आप इजाजत दें तो मैं अब वो वाले पॉइंट थोड़ा हिंदी में इलाबोरेट करना चाहूंगी। तो मेरा सबसे पहला पॉइंट मैं जो कहना चाह रही हूँ वो ये है कि टॉर्चर, ये तो बिल्कुल मतलब साफ सामने आता है कि टॉर्चर का यूज करके जिनको अपराधी माना जाता है, जिनको टेररिस्ट माना जाता है, उन पर जिस तरह के जुल्म किए जाते हैं, उनका हमें और उनकी वो जो जुल्म किए जाते हैं, ये क्या सिर्फ पुलिसमैन की गलतियों से होते हैं, या कि स्ट्रक्चर ही ऐसा है कि जिसमें कि टॉर्चर को माना जाता है कि टॉर्चर की जो जज बैठे हुए हैं, जो डॉक्टर बैठे हुए हैं, जिनको विटनेस मानकर अंदर पेश किया जाता है कोर्ट में, तो ये जो सिस्टम है इसके बारे में मैं थोड़ा सोचना चाहूंगी और किस तरह से मनीषा जी ने ये बात टेरर लॉज के थ्रू हमारे सामने रखी, लेकिन इसका हम पुलिस प्रोसीजर्स के ऊपर भी कुछ सोच विचार कर सकते हैं, क्योंकि इसका एक जो मुझे पता नहीं कि उनका ये मकसद होता है कि नहीं, लेकिन इसका जो फल होता है वो ये होता है कि पूरी जो कम्युनिटीज हैं, जो कौम है, ये उसके ऊपर हमला बन जाता है। और किस तरह से, ये खाली एब्स्ट्रैक्ट में नहीं है, क्योंकि जब आप समझे किसी को आप लाते हैं जेल में कि जी इन्होंने ये टेररिज्म में इन्वॉल्व हैं, और इनका केस टेरर लॉस के अंदर किया जा रहा है, तो उसके साथ साथ पुलिस सिर्फ उनको नहीं लाती है, पुलिस उनके घर वालों को, उनके पड़ोसियों को, उनके रिश्तेदारों पे जोर डालती है कि अगर आप विटनेस नहीं देंगे, आप कहिए कि हमने इनको देखा था कि ये पाकिस्तान से कुछ लोग आए हुए थे, उनको इन्होंने पनाह दिया था, और अगर आप नहीं मानेंगे, अगर आप नहीं कहेंगे तो आपको भी टॉर्चर किया जा सकता है, आपको भी हम एक केस में फंसा देंगे, आपके पेरेंट्स को केस में फंसा देंगे, आपकी बीवी को यहाँ पर हम कैद कर लेंगे। और ये जो प्रेशर दिया जाता है उससे कम्युनिटीज भी बिल्कुल मैं कहूँगी कि टूट जाती हैं। जिस तरह के कपड़े को काट के बिल्कुल टुकड़े कर दिया जाता है, उसी तरह कम्युनिटीज के भी टुकड़े किए जाते हैं। मैंने ये खुद अपने फील्ड वर्क में देखा, और ये वाहिद जी की किताब में बिल्कुल साफ नजर आता है कि उनके भाई को रोज फोन करके कहा जा रहा है कि भैया आप अपने भाई को समझाइए, अगर उन्होंने ये कन्फेशन नहीं साइन किया तो ये होगा, वो होगा, और या तो ल्योर दिए जाते हैं कि आपको फ्लैट दे देंगे, आपको ये दे देंगे, या धमकियां दी जाती हैं। तो ये चीजें जो हैं, इसको हमें सोचना चाहिए कि किस तरह से, और यही मैं मानती हूँ कि वाहिद जी की किताब में बहुत साफ ढंग से सामने आ जाता है कि ये एक पूरी कौम को नष्ट कर देता है, बिल्कुल खत्म कर देता है। तो दूसरी चीज ये मैं कहना चाहूंगी कि जो डेफिनेशन है, जो विभाषा है इसकी टेरर की, उसके अंदर तो ये होता है कि जी ये अगर देश की सोवरेनिटी और इंटेग्रिटी के ऊपर हमला है, और कोर्ट जजमेंट्स भी हैं जिसमें कहा गया है कि अगर ये गैंग की आपस की लड़ाई है जिसके अंदर आपने उसको अपराधी माना है, तो ये टेरर लॉ के अंदर ट्राई नहीं किया जाता। लेकिन क्योंकि वो कंस्पिरेसी दिखाना चाहते हैं, इसलिए आप फिर से ये चीज अब वाहिद जी की किताब में देखेंगे कि कितने लोगों को अरेस्ट किया जाता है। टाडा के अंदर बॉम्बे ब्लास्ट में 1993 में शायद 125 जनों को अरेस्ट किया गया था, जिनको रखा गया था। तो अगर अरेस्ट किया जाता है, अगर ये भी ठीक है कि उनको रिलीज कर दिया जाता है क्योंकि कहते हैं कि उनके अगेंस्ट एविडेंस नहीं है, लेकिन जिस पीरियड में उनको पुलिस कस्टडी में रखा जाता है, उस पीरियड में जिस तौर पर टॉर्चर किया जाता है, उससे कौन साक्षी है और कौन एक्यूज्ड है, इसका फर्क बिल्कुल ब्लर कर दिया जाता है कि इसमें कोई फर्क ही नहीं है। अगर आप कहें, आप पे जोर दिया जा रहा है कि आपने ये देखा था, आप कह नहीं रहे हैं कि आपने देखा था, आप कहिए कि ये देखा था, तो आप विटनेस के हिसाब से उनको लाएं, एक्यूज्ड के हिसाब से नहीं लाएं। लेकिन जो जिस तरह से ये लीगली, इस पर लीगल स्कॉलर्स भी और सोच सकते हैं कि किस तरह से इन डिफरेंसेस को ब्लर किया जाता है केस के दौरान। तीसरी चीज मैं ये कहना चाहती हूँ कि इसीलिए अगर आप देखें तो हर एक केस में मतलब कुछ तो चार्जशीट देखें कि 300 पत्तों में जा रहे हैं, 300 पेज की चार्जशीट किए जा रहे हैं कि 150 पेज के चार्जशीट किए जा रहे हैं, क्योंकि हर तरह का अपराध उसमें दर्ज किया जा रहा है कि ये सिमी के मेंबर थे, इनके पास नाजायज बंदूक थी, इन्होंने ये गाड़ी चलाई थी, इन्होंने वहां पर ये देखा था कि वो उससे बात कर रहा है। तो ये इनका मकसद प्राय यही होता है कि अगर इस बार छूट भी जाए तो आपके पास एक रिकॉर्ड रह गया है कि आप आगे उनको फिर से फंसा सकते हैं। ये वाहिद जी के साथ भी हुआ था कि उन्होंने बाद में कहा कि आपको कोर्ट ने जो रिहा किया वो ट्रायल के बाद बॉम्ब ब्लास्ट के केस में रिहा किया है, सिमी के केस में नहीं रिहा किया गया है। तो आप सोचिए कि आप कितनी जिंदगी में सारा टाइम आपको देखना पड़ेगा कि मेरे अगेंस्ट कोई केस हो रहा है कि नहीं हो रहा है, और हरदम आपको करना पड़ेगा कि अपनी जिंदगी जब आप जी रहे हैं, मेरी आवाज नहीं आ रही, कि आपकी जिंदगी जब आप जी रहे हैं, अब आ रही है
वीना मैडम? आपकी आवाज रुक गई, जरा देख लीजिए।
अच्छा ठीक है, अब आ रही है आवाज, क्योंकि मैंने अपना मेरा ये तो ऑन है। शरीब आप देखेंगे कि आवाज आ रही है कि नहीं?
जी, आवाज आपकी आ रही है साफ। वाहिद भाई थोड़ा सा आप देखिए।
शारिक भाई आ रही है आपको आवाज?
हाँ, आवाज आ रही है, सबको आ रही है।
आप जरा आपका शायद वो कुछ देखिए, आप
ईयरफोन्स हैं तो ईयरफोन्स लगा लें।
ठीक है, मैं आगे बोलूं?
जी 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 वीना प्लीज।
ओके, तो मेरा कहना यह है कि ये जो इतने सारे डॉक्यूमेंट होते हैं, उनको अगर आप उन पर अगर आप तवज्जो दें तो आप देखेंगे कि बेल पिटिशंस जो हैं कि कोर्ट किस तरह से बेल पिटिशन रिजेक्ट करते हैं। जैसे कि अगर कहेंगे कि अगर इनके खिलाफ तो हमें कोई सबूत नहीं मिला, लेकिन हम कई लोगों को इंटेरोगेट कर रहे हैं, और अगर हम इन पर कि अगर हम इनकी और भी माइन्यूट इंटेरोगेशन करें, तो ये माइन्यूट इंटेरोगेशन का मतलब क्या है? मतलब ये है कि अगर आपको भी पता है कि माइन्यूट इंटेरोगेशन का मतलब है कि हम टॉर्चर से इनसे ये इंफॉर्मेशन निकालेंगे, जज को भी पता है इसके बारे में, तो फिर ये क्यों अलाउ किया जाता है कि पुलिस कस्टडी में आप इनको रख सकते हैं? तो ये जो चीजें हैं, बेल पिटिशन है कि इसको कहा गया है कि रोज पुलिस स्टेशन में रिपोर्ट करें, लेकिन जब आप पुलिस स्टेशन में जाएंगे तब आपको पता नहीं है कि आपको सिर्फ रिपोर्ट करके कहेंगे कि हाँ आप घर वापस चले जाइए, या आपको वहां 3 घंटा वेट करना पड़ेगा, या आपको उस दिन अंदर कर लेंगे और टॉर्चर करके फिर अगले दिन छोड़ देंगे, राइट? तो ये जो सारे टेक्निक्स हैं जिनको मैं माइनर टेक्निक्स माने जाते हैं, लेकिन इनको भी टॉर्चर के अंदर लाना चाहिए, क्योंकि ये इससे जो अपनी जिंदगी जीने का जो भी साधन है उनको नष्ट किए जाने के उपाय हैं एक तरह से। और लास्ट में बोलना चाहती हूँ कि हमें सबसे, यानी 2 चीजें और बोलना चाहती हूँ। तो एक तो ये बोलना चाहती हूँ मैं कि ये एक बात थोड़ी समझने में मुश्किल आती है कि हमको पता है कि टॉर्चर से कितने जुल्म किए जाते हैं। हमको पता है कि हर एक लीगल कन्वेंशन में कहा गया है कि इनह्यूमन टॉर्चर एंड इनह्यूमन पनिशमेंट्स आर बैंड। तो फिर कैसे ये कुछ बड़े बड़े जो स्कॉलर्स हैं, कई ने अच्छा काम किया सिविल लिबर्टीज वगैरह में, लेकिन जब टॉर्चर का सवाल आता है तो वो कहते हैं अब टेररिज्म का थ्रेट इतना बढ़ गया है कि आपको एक्सेप्शनल कंडीशंस में टॉर्चर अलाउड होना चाहिए। ये देरशोविट्स करके एक लीगल स्कॉलर हैं, हार्वर्ड में पढ़ाते हैं। माइकल वॉल्जर करके पॉलिटिकल साइंटिस्ट है, प्रिंसटन में पढ़ाते हैं। कोई छोटी मोटी यूनिवर्सिटीज नहीं है, बहुत बड़े नाम वाली यूनिवर्सिटीज हैं। लेकिन उनका कहना यह है कि हमेशा इस सवाल इस तरह से पेश किया जाता है कि अगर एक जगह आपको ये हो कि आपको पता है कि स्कूल बस में बॉम्ब रखा गया, आपके पास एक्यूज्ड है, अगर आप क्या करेंगे? उस एक्यूज्ड को अगर आप टॉर्चर करेंगे कि नहीं? अगर आप टॉर्चर कर रहे हैं और वो इंफॉर्मेशन दे तो आप 300 बच्चों की जान बचा सकते हैं। अब मेरी प्रॉब्लम इसमें ये है कि इसको टिकिंग बम सिनारियो जो कहा जाता है, मेरी प्रॉब्लम इसमें ये है कि जितने टॉर्चर की एविडेंस है हमारे पास, उसमें से ये नहीं है कि किसी को इंफॉर्मेशन पता है और टॉर्चर के अंदर उसने रिलीज करी है। टॉर्चर पोस्ट फैक्टम होता है कि जब हो गया एक अटैक तो उसके बाद आप कन्फेशन लेने के लिए टॉर्चर करते हैं। इनफैक्ट दर्शोविट्स की ओन उनकी जो लिखा है कि वॉल्जर ने जो लिखा है उसमें जितने उदाहरण हैं वो उदाहरण मेड अप उदाहरण है। एक भी उदाहरण आपने एक्चुअली एम्पिरिकली नहीं लिया जिससे कि हम बोल सकें कि भाई हाँ इसमें टॉर्चर ने काम किया था। एक्चुअली अब जो सीआईए की लास्ट रिपोर्ट है उसमें ये कहा गया है कि एक्चुअली जो भी इंटेरोगेशन गुआंतानामो वगैरह में टॉर्चर के अंदर किए गए थे उनसे कोई यूजफुल इंफॉर्मेशन नहीं मिली है। तो इस पर्टिकुलर जब ये सिनारियो बिल्कुल साफ है तो ये क्यों है कि कि टॉर्चर का जस्टिफिकेशन, दर्शोविट्स का कहना है कि ये छुपके छुपके नहीं होना चाहिए। अगर हम इसको बिल्कुल ट्रांसपेरेंट कर दें, खुली आम सबको पता हो कि टॉर्चर होता है और जज की परमिशन लें कि हमको इसको टॉर्चर करना है, जुडिशियल वारंट लें, तो ये हिपोक्रेसी चली जाएगी। और मेरा कहना यह है कि आपकी हिपोक्रेसी से बचाने के लिए दूसरे के ऊपर इतना आप आतंक करेंगे तो ये भी तो एक तरह का टेरर ही है। तो इसको लेकर मुझे लगता है कि काफी कुछ लिखना चाहिए, क्योंकि इसका इम्पैक्ट होता है सब जगह पर कि आप कह रहे हैं अमेरिका के बारे में, और अमेरिका में भी एरिया 4 शिकागो में अफ्रीकन अमेरिकन के ऊपर दिखाया गया है कि इतने टॉर्चर उनको पकड़ के जब भी छोटे मोटे क्राइम के लिए भी जब आते थे तो उन पे 10 साल कम से कम, एक विल्सन के केस में उसको टॉर्चर करा गया, उसके भाई को टॉर्चर किया गया, लेकिन जज के सामने जब जो इंजरीज थी पेश की जाती थी तो जब पुलिस का कहना होता था ये तो सीढ़ी से गिर गए थे, ये तो आपस में उन लोगों की लड़ाई हो गई थी। 10 साल लगे उस पे कि एक जज ने फाइनली माना कि नहीं ये इंजरीज पुलिस के द्वारा की गई इंजरीज हैं। तो इसको लेकर मुझे लगता है कि और बातचीत होनी चाहिए। इसको हमारे हर घर में बातचीत होनी चाहिए, हर मोहल्ले में बातचीत होनी चाहिए। जिस तरह की कोविड को लेकर हुआ कि लोगों का जो रोष था वो हर जगह पे प्रकट किया गया, उस तरह टॉर्चर के बारे में भी आप जो लोग इनोसेंस नेटवर्क में इसको लेकर जो आपने कहा ना कि हम चाहते हैं कि हर जगह ये बातचीत हो, ये सच में बहुत बहुत जरूरी है। और वाहिद जी ने कहा कि मैं इस पे बोलता ही रहूंगा जब तक इस पे इस पे रिलीज ना हो, लेकिन रिलीज तब होगा जब हर एक घर में इस बात पे चर्चा होनी शुरू होगी। और लास्टली मैं ये कहना चाहती हूँ कि जुडिशियल पर्पसेस के लिए जो है कि हाँ टॉर्चर को माना गया है कि पब्लिक ऑफिशियल ने किया था, लेकिन आज के समाज में अगर हम देखें तो टॉर्चर खाली पुलिसमैन ही नहीं कर रहे हैं, घरों में टॉर्चर हो रहे हैं। क्योंकि जो जिस तरह के आप देखें कि डाउरी डेथ्स हैं, कि जो औरतों पर जिस तरह के टॉर्चर किए जाते हैं, रेप केसेस हैं जहां पर कि हर एक रेप केस में जो सामने आया उसमें उसको खाली सेक्सुअल ऑफेंस मानकर नहीं चलना चाहिए, वो भी टॉर्चर है और टॉर्चर किया जाता है उसके अंदर। और ये जो टेक्निक्स हैं इसके बारे में ये पूरे समाज में फैल जाती है। तो मुझे लगता है कि ये भी मेरे लिए काफी बड़ी चीज है। तो मैं इसको एंड करूंगी। एक आपने जो किया वो इतना, भाई साहब आपने जो किताब लिखी, जब मैंने उसको पढ़ा तो मुझे सबसे पहले याद आया फैज का ये शेर, जो अगर आप इजाजत दें तो, मैं, ये उर्दू इतनी अच्छी नहीं है लेकिन मैं अगर इजाजत दें तो मैं एक बार वो पढ़ लूं, जब उन्होंने लिखा कि मत्ताए लौह वो कलम छिन गए तो क्या गम है, मत्ताए लौह एक कलम छिन गए तो क्या गम है, कि खूने दिल में डुबा लिए हैं उंगलियां मैंने, ज़बां पे मुहर लगी है तो क्या के रख दी है, हर एक हल्का जंजीर में ज़बां में। तो आपका इनोसेंस नेटवर्क ये कर रहा है, आपकी किताब ये कर रही है, और उसके लिए मैं आपको बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया देना चाहती हूँ।
शुक्रिया। और थैंक यू प्रोफेसर दास। और हमने उंगलियां तो डुबा ही ली हैं, and now we just heard this, the large and minute ways in which life and all its fullness is extinguished through so many means by the state. And of course we are resisting, and we will. Usha here has been looking at it very deeply. Now, how from within and without do we get liberties and the fullness of life back? Usha, please.
Thank you, Sharif. And thank you, Manisha and Veena. There's so much thinking to do on this, and it's so important to keep doing this. I just think it doesn't happen enough. So what very often happens is that we are dealing with a situation when it happens, and it's most of the time reactive. And Father Stan's death, for instance, was one case where we saw an outpouring of outrage that such a thing could happen. It had visibility, it came in a case which has had visibility for a very long time. And one of the things that we find in that, which is so different from what Wahid Bhai has experienced, and which tells us about this thing called institutional bias and general bias among people, is that when it happened in the Bhima Koregaon cases, the really strange thing about the Bhima Koregaon case, and what we need to remember and address in that, is that time after time, you've had sets of people with impeccable reputations accepted by, this is a reputation that is global, stepping forward and saying, but these are the people who do good in this country. Why on earth? How can they be in this position? What are you finding criminal in how they act? They are the people who speak for the Adivasis. They are the people who are the lawyers who are appearing for workers, for the working classes. They are the people who are working against slum demolitions, against land acquisition, so that people can have rights. And how is it that that this is what you're doing? And you find that actually this is a good time to discuss it, because Father Stan's death has completely taken away any credibility and legitimacy that this kind of system can have. What we need to address along with that is this thing of institutional bias. This institutional bias has been growing in this country over the years. Institutional bias is about institutionalizing prejudice, institutionalizing power which accompanies this prejudice, and allowing the police forces, for instance, and allowing the use of the police forces to do various things which can hardly be called the law. I mean, they could easily come within this idea of atrocity. And that's the remarkable thing. So we find that, you know, over a period of time, even if we were to start just with the Sikh riots and read what happened in the Sikh riots about how the police were complicit, either they, you know, where they didn't participate in it, they were egging people on, they were throwing matchboxes so that people can do whatever it was that they wanted to do. They stood by and watched while the riot, you know, while the carnage happened. So we see that this, you know, one of the things that we're going to have to deal with in a very central kind of way is institutional rights. We saw it again, and I think everybody needs to see what happened in Hashimpura, where this was custodial killing. It was institutional killing. It wasn't just a bias that various police officers practiced. It was all of them getting together, rounding up Muslims, putting them into a van, taking them to a river, shooting them, and it's literally like taking them to the grave and putting them in. And they could well have got away with it if the NHRC hadn't at one stage managed to step in and get some additional evidence in. So this, and in 2002, we saw again the whole idea of, you know, the police either complicit or, you know, participating in it themselves or allowing these things to happen. So this business about institutional bias is very deep and has to be thrown out. And the one way, you know, some of the things that we need to do in this, one is we need to take away immunity. We need to take away immunity that the law provides through sanction, where a state can decide whether it wants to allow a prosecution to start or not and to be pursued. And we need to take away impunity because there is protection for this kind of action. For institutional prejudice to be practiced, there is protection. But what I actually want to, you know, when you called Sharib, I was thinking that this is a time actually we need to take stock of all those areas where liberty has got eroded. And we need now to have an agenda for restoring liberty. We can't keep waiting for things to happen. And this is like a sliding scale where it's just slipping away. It's just going away. And I just thought I'd say some of the places where we see this happen. UAPA, of course, is the most obvious, and it stares us in the face, like Pota and Tada did before, like AFSPA does very often. You have here too, you have UAPA. But UAPA is actually a remarkable law because it's become like, I mean, it's really like the waste paper basket of all anti-civil liberties activity by the state. So you have, you know, they start with saying Naxal activity, and therefore we need these unlawful activities to be taken care of. Then when there is a call asking for AFSPA to be repealed, the committee comes up with a finding which says, yeah, you know, everybody wants AFSPA to go. So maybe you can take all that and put it into UAP. Then you have POTA going, because POTA was, you know, it was completely delegitimized. And when POTA has to be taken out, you can put all the provisions of POTA into UAP. And in its later avatar, you find that you have this, which I think we just haven't studied enough and which we need to understand much more, which is the Financial Action Task Force. It's incredible how you have an international, international intervention working to destroy our liberties. In the name, initially, 1980s when it started, it was in the name of drug money, which should not be, you know, the idea of controlling drugs and the drug traffic. Then it goes on after 9/11 into terrorism. Then it goes into any kind of thing that's considered illegal activity in relation to the economy. So just about anything, when we say that, when Manisha says that the definition is so, you know, vague, it's because it has to take in just about anything that the state wants to get its hands on. And I think UAPA, after this 2013 amendment, where they brought in the FATF, the Financial Action Task Force, has also been, it's been sullied by international action. And I think we need to hold those international agencies directly responsible for coming into our countries and working at destroying our liberties. we've had preventive detention for a very long time now. And it's one of those real tragedies of that moment of independence and of constitution making, that we couldn't throw what Kerala High Court has recently called the politics of suspicion. It's a jurisdiction of suspicion. And, you know, I think you may be planning to do a certain act, and therefore I'm going to pick you up and put you inside even now. We know that the people who are inside in preventive detention are in very large measure from the Muslim community and from Dalit community. It's like these are dispensable communities, and these are communities that can be controlled by the state through using these extraordinary laws. Soon after the constitution accepted that preventive detention can stay, there were a lot of people, I mean, there were at least some people like Nambiar and MK Nambiar who said, what on earth are we doing with this kind of a provision in our law? How did we say that we've come from colonial times into independence and retained this kind of executive power? But what we found is that instead of vanishing, it has got stronger and stronger. And now you have what you call special and local laws. When you look at the Crime Records Bureau, you'll find that they are special and local laws, all of them allowing for extraordinary amounts of preventive detention being practiced. Sedition, so what I'm doing now is setting an agenda for all the things that need to go. So I think it's like we need to get clear on what are the things that we just simply cannot have. Obviously, it won't be a comprehensive agenda yet, but I'm hoping to just start a discussion with this so that whatever government comes after this should make these their agenda if the people of this country are to have any freedom or liberty at all, and if they believe in it at all. And political parties need to commit themselves to this even before they start thinking of getting themselves into a seat of power. So the third is sedition. Fortunately for us, it seems like the Supreme Court is willing to look at this again. It's very unclear why when in the 1960s sedition was considered by the Supreme Court, they did not think that they should just throw it out, because it's actually, the idea that in a democracy, you must act with affection for the state, for the government as established by law. It's a contradiction in terms. As a citizen, the job is for the state, for the government to act in a way which I approve of. It's not the other way around. So, what I say and what I do, I don't have to act so that the government will approve of it. I am the citizen, and that's getting lost in all of this. In all these liberty and freedom issues, we are losing this. So sedition is something that worked perfectly for a colonial enterprise, where they came in and said, listen, I'm not going to allow you to question my presence here, and you can't say anything to people which will cause disaffection or ill will to me, because I'm a colonial power, I'm an outsider. I've come in and I have to at least keep you completely silent or I throw you inside. And we've seen the use of sedition by colonial powers through the ages. It has absolutely no place in a country which has become free, and where it's democratic, where in fact governments, political parties are perpetually slamming each other out. And then we say that you should not be saying things about a party that is in power or a government that is in power. There's no place for that in the law at all. So while the Supreme Court is today talking only about, journalists should have, how can you charge journalists with sedition for this? It's actually very important that all citizens have this right restored to us. The new laws have been coming in, which we've allowed to come in, because we've really not attacked it. We haven't noticed sometimes what civil liberties implication it has. So the Prevention of Money Laundering Act is one such legislation. I think we need to go back to it. This again is part of that Financial Action Task Force group, but the kind of provisions that you have in the Prevention of Money Laundering Act are very repressive. And it's one of those places where they've been trying to shift the onus onto the accused. So they say, okay, we are charging that this property that you have actually came from the proceeds of money laundering. Now prove that that did not happen. So the onus is shifted, and which means that you can just charge people and accuse them, and then they have to sit. And of course, under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act 2, the first thing you do is pick up and put a person in prison. The one thing about the PMLA Act so far is that it's bringing in a new class of prisoner. So suddenly you have people who, who are businessmen, people, who are part of the economy. I mean, most of the others are people who are not seen as relevant to the economy, who they put into prison. This is one place where you find that they are picking up people who are part of that economy. And you can see the extent to which the state has an interest in controlling these parts of that economy. So it depends on who they take things from. India, we must remember, got into this whole money laundering business after the UN got into it, and they said it's about terrorism. India projects itself in the international arena as champions against terror. And that's the route through which they find this. Now, terror has become one of those ways by which we completely destroy procedure. And we know that in criminal law, the only protection that people have is procedure. So if you take that away, there is very little else that people have. The other thing which at this point is also pretty poignant, also because of Father Stan, but even otherwise, I mean, we've been seeing this over the years. The development project of the state has made the Adivasi the enemy of development. And so you find that there are large numbers of Adivasis who are in the prisons. And when the tribal committee was acting, we went to Jagdalpur jail. It had a pretty decent jailer, but what was he going to do if you had, a whole load of tribals who had been put in? And it's exactly what Veena was saying. You charge them with one offense, and then you keep on adding offenses to it so that they can never get out. And it's like a generation of staying inside the prison. By the time you get out, the land is no longer there, the community is no longer there, it's all done. So this way of using criminal law to push ahead a project of development is one of those unbelievable things in a democracy. I mean, I can't imagine that we can call ourselves a democracy and still have this. So, and the interesting thing is that there have been committees that have been set up. You set up a committee to go and see, okay, why are there so many tribals in prison? See if it is possible for some of them to be released, which among them can be released. So there, for instance, there was a Nirmala Bhuj committee which went into Chhattisgarh, and they recommended a number of people to be released, maybe some of them on grounds of poverty, some of them, different kinds of grounds. But in every one of those cases, you'll find that there will be other charges. So they can be released under some charges, but the other charges will keep them inside. So it's not the person that they are dealing with at all. Criminal law has stopped dealing with the person. It is dealing with policy and with the imperatives of policy, which is completely different. It is dealing with prejudice and what prejudice is allowed to function. And the third that it deals with is poverty. So it's politics and protest and poverty. In poverty, you find, I was actually amazed when I saw that when I read the anti-beggary law, and found that the anti-beggary law allows for incarceration of a person because they are poor and they put out their hand and said, I'm hungry, can you give me something? Up to 10 years and more. And it's one of those strange things where the first time they are put in, they're taken away. If they give an undertaking that within 1 month they will be gainfully employed, then they can be released. Who can give this kind of course, people give that undertaking and leave, and then they come back and they are considered to be recidivists. So poverty produces recidivism in this country. And it completely, if you're poor, you don't really have a right to be free. You don't have a right to liberty at all. In fact, I must say at this point that one of the most disturbing things I heard in recent times was the Bombay High Court, when they were hearing the question of COVID, the matter concerning COVID, and they said that there are wandering mentally ill people in the streets. And they, in their concern, said that, they are mentally ill, they won't know, they don't have IDs, they won't be able to, they can't remember when they get their shot. So but they should be vaccinated like everybody else. So vaccinate them and maybe put a tattoo on their body. And then when you have the second vaccine, you can have another tattoo because they won't be able to remember it otherwise. So there is something that has happened in our psyche which has normalized all this. And we have to work at taking the normalcy out of this and showing the criminality that is inherent in this. The other thing that has happened in recent times, and I think it's a phenomenon that we might want to revisit and look at, if we look at what happened in this period, a high-powered committee was set up to look at prison population and see during COVID who could be released, under trials especially. So they said there are a number of under trials who can be released, and they can, so find out, identify them, because prisons are overcrowded. There are too many people in them, and it's unsafe in COVID times to have so much. So you've got to decongest the prison. So that was done. A number of people were released, and they said, how long will you be released for? Till COVID, till it gets better. And when it gets better, you've got to come back into jail. And I've been thinking ever since, if these are people who are under trials, and if they could be let outside, their trials haven't happened yet, you start their trial. And if they can be let out during COVID, and there is nothing, the problem that you've had in that time, why are you asking them to go back into prison and lose their liberty? What is this idea that the state has a right to deprive a person of liberty? It makes liberty some kind of a largesse that's given by the state. And that it certainly is not. So what I'm finding is that, there are certain phenomena that we see around us. We see an insecure state, for instance. A state that says, everybody is against me, people could do things against me. And the idea of national security, which like terror has no defined meaning, which is just about anything at all. And like in Chhattisgarh, if one went before a judge and said, this is a Naxal case. No, nobody has it. There's no such definition in law. There's no such thing as a Naxal case. Yeah. But you'll have them saying this is a Naxal case. There is no question of getting any bail at all. So here too, if it's a UAPA case, so this is the other thing that we need to look at. All these designated courts that have come to deal with these cases, designated courts are, beginning to see themselves as dealing with terror cases, as dealing with cases which are specific to the kind of offense for which they are coming there. So they see it as having happened. The bias is that any case coming to this court is a terror case. So then you treat the person before you as someone who's not just charged, but with a certain prejudice that goes along with it, because it is in that court. Many of these, almost all the offenses that are defined in these cases can all be dealt with under regular law. There are some parts that cannot, and I don't think they should even be offenses. The extent to which we've had an increase of crimes of acquaintance, you know somebody, you spoke to somebody, you wrote to somebody, you read somebody's book. These have become very close to thought crime, but they are represented in these cases by saying that you just the knowledge of a person. I remember during the Veerappan years, every time the state needed Veerappan to be accosted, someone to go and negotiate with him, they would call Nakiran. So he was a reporter, and he had access to Veerappan. You needed people like that. When you had in Andhra, you had the Committee of Concerned Citizens, which was formed because they wanted to speak between the People's War and the state and stop the kind of things that was happening, especially the violence and the death, but which of course later it was clear that it was about land and not about the violence. You needed people like Kannabiran, you needed people like S.R. Shankaran, Hargopal, you needed them to be there to be able to go and talk to both sides. Today, it is a crime to even know people. It's not about whether you believe what they believe or not. It's not about whether you participate in their activities. You should have nothing to do with them. So you have to preserve yourself by not reaching out to anybody at all, because you never know. They could be someone accused of a crime tomorrow. This crime of acquaintance is breaking up our society more than can be said. And that has to be, taken out. Public safety acts everywhere. I think Kashmir is somewhere where we see it all the time, but public safety acts are everywhere. And we need, therefore, these disturbed areas acts, public safety acts, all these have been procedures processes by which the state exercises control over people. What makes the kind of thing that happened with Wahid Bhai, in the Akshardham case, in cases like this, what makes it even more, urgent in a sense, because it's for us to address it, is because these are all crimes of labeling. These are not about who did what. This is about picking up people, if they are Muslims and you can label them, it will be believed. And the judiciary too has moved away from skepticism into pragmatism. A judiciary has to be skeptical when a state brings someone before them and says that this person committed a certain crime, and ask the state to establish it. That skepticism is what keeps the rule of law alive. Instead, what we find, because of this talk about national security, you find that it ends up with a certain kind of pragmatism where they say, I'm not getting into this. Heaven knows what this is about. I'm not getting into this. And that's one of the ways, the tragedy for those who are for those who are affected by institutional bias, and for many of the Muslims who are accused and who are innocent, you can have a judgment like the Akshardham judgment, where the court actually says that the police fabricated evidence. The Supreme Court says that the police fabricated evidence, and there is no consequence. It doesn't even add to the skepticism of the court in further cases that come before. So I genuinely believe that we need to start, the CRPC, there are two ways of reading it. The Criminal Procedure Code can be read as a manual for how police can act. Or, like some of us read it, it's a code that prescribes the limit within which the police can act. It is not about giving the police whatever power they want. So when you say search and seizure, it doesn't mean you walk in and do what you want in a house. You should know what you're looking for and pick up only that. Now, when it goes further and it's outside the law altogether, for instance, hostage taking, there are so many reported cases on this. It's astonishing that we've allowed it to carry on like this. The whole thing that Veena was saying about Wahid Bhai's experience, go and tell your brother that your parents will be picked up. If you look at Buller's case, you find a similar kind of thing having happened. You'll find that in his case, 2 members of his family actually died in police custody. The connection will never be made and it will never be investigated. That is a problem for a state, and a state has, that's a problem for a people. We find now that there are new ways in which this kind of deprivation of liberty is happening, as if that is something that the state has the power to do and therefore will do. And this is coming under the Citizenship Act. We find detention centers being built in this country, and there isn't an outcry against it. Detention, there are people, we've actually had a redefinition of citizenship. It's not only that we've had this idea that everyone other than Muslims who come in from the neighboring countries, from the 3 countries, are going to get citizenship without having to fulfill many of those other conditions of citizenship, and that the Muslims won't get it. It is also that in 2003, they changed the law, and they said that, before 2000 until up to 1987, anyone born in India was entitled to Indian citizenship. In 87, they amended that law and said, well, no, either parent should be an Indian citizen for the child to be an Indian citizen. In 2003, they changed it and said, if either parent is an illegal migrant, then the child doesn't get citizenship. So it's really taking away from your own citizen, even if you think that the other person is an illegal migrant, from your own citizen, the right to your child. And for the child to be stateless forever and to land up in detention centers. I think the horror of it is beginning to dawn on us now. And, it kind of keeps adding to the agenda that we have of what needs to be dismantled. Within the judiciary, I think it's really important. There are glimmers every once in a while and they give us hope. And I think they should. I think there is like the Vatali judgment, for instance, is a problem because it basically says that whoever is charged under the law, under the UAPA, should be able to show, actually the court should just take what is given in the prosecution, whatever the prosecution says, as true. And the person who is accused has to prove that it's not true, but it can't be done by looking at the evidence.
Yeah.
So it just doesn't, it's plainly something that can't work. And the good thing is that recently you've had 2 judges saying that, okay, it looks like this needs to be looked at again. So if it is looked at again, it's a good thing. But I think that what we are learning is that solidarity among people is going to be the ultimate answer, because we can't depend on institutions to be, to understand, to see, to, institutions seem to work to a different logic. Sometimes they get what's wrong, sometimes they don't. And with the judiciary, it could move either way. But with Parliament, it has been a steady decline. And I really think it's important to start working even now, not only with those, not only thinking about other elections and whatever, but with every state government, and to work at destroying the kind of structure that is in these laws, which allows for this total destruction of liberty. Today, we are living in a time where politics, poverty, protest, all these, can result in deprivation of liberty, but even more dangerously, complete lawlessness among the law implementers of law can result in deprivation of liberty. Both these have to be dealt with. And I just want to stop it saying one or maybe 2 more things. One is that I want to reinforce what Veena was saying. There is no reason why we don't have a torture law, a law against torture. And we've gone through that whole discussion in this country. And Parliament has considered it, Parliamentary Standing Committee has looked at it, everyone sees that there is a logic to it. But for some reason, we are not willing to make a law. Think about what it means when in 1993, the National Human Rights Commission said that every case of custodial death, you have to videotape the postmortem. Custodial death means that in that case, you had torture which resulted in death. But behind that is institutionalized torture. And we take that as something that happens and turn our eyes away from it. So I want to kind of emphasize what Veena was saying, which is that we really need, every corner of the street, there's a police station where there's torture happening. And communities pretend like it's not happening because it seems to be happening to the other. And that simply has to stop. And the state cannot be finding that it's all right to have torture. In fact, it was interesting in one of the recent discussions that happened, you had Nitin Sethi, I think, in one of those discussions, asking a participant, he said, okay, you're saying that this is all right. But tomorrow, if you are not in power and it were done with you, and you were to come on this platform, will you still say that it's okay if it happened to your people? That idea that it can happen to my own, that because of our class, caste, community differences, we don't seem to be able to think together. Political parties have to be made to do that, and we have to start that process right away. And I will stop with that.
Thank you, Usha. We are still breathing in all that you have said, the wide. We have 7 minutes before the call crashes on its own, because that's the limit we have in the call. So if Usha, Veena, Manusha, if anybody wants to come in with a comment, answer to something in the chat people are saying, please.
Sharif, can I say something?
Yes.
So I think one of the questions was that the word torture there's no good translation of the word torture in Indian languages. And I would say that what is important is to realize that words acquire life through usage. And so torture is in a way a vernacular term now. I've sort of really worked with pretty poor neighborhoods, and people will use these words like saying कि उन्होंने हमको बहुत torture किया, right? Now, obviously, for legal purposes, you might want to restrict it. But I think that it's equally true that allowing these expressions, not necessarily, I mean, simply recognizing that the way that words acquire meaning is through actual life experiences, right? And so in that sense, I am less troubled by the word-to-word translation as long as the sense of what is torture is also being being defined and expanded through the way people actually use it, right? And so there'll always be these things where contexts where you need to muscle it down and say, there was a very interesting case in the US where they said if a policeman did torture, but he didn't do it as a policeman. And after 10 years, as I said, in the Wilson case or in Monet Declaration, they said, no, a police, there are customs which the police follows, which have the force of law. And I think something like that might be actually quite an interesting line to think of in response to this very, very, very interesting, very important question.
Thank you, Veena. We have 4 minutes to go. Usha, you built for us a very large view of what needs to be done. Could we end with one final comment from you and some good wishes?
One final comment at the end of that. Okay, so there's a very important question they've asked on how do we deal with institutional bias. The first thing is to take away immunity. It is to do away with the impunity that they have, which means that the sanction power cannot rest with the executive, which is using the police. So it has to be, the sanction power has to be with some other entity where citizenry is involved. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to do this. And if we find, for instance, that, it's like you have in the International Court of Justice. If your community is affected, then you should be able to, be represented on it. So we can have communities defined in various ways. It may just be that territory. We don't want to break it down into being Hindu, Muslim, Christian, that's not how we want to do it. But it is important to have that voice heard and for a person to be able to pick who will be there. If I have been tortured, if I have died, or if somebody, if I've died, then some member of my family should have a say in who will be there to decide the question of sanction. Because if we keep it within these institutions, establishments will save themselves. You cannot run away from it. And the last thing is this, we have to remember that it is the state that makes law. And it is the state that has, and when we say state in this, it is at this point, different governments. And it is the state that has control over all forms of violence, including the infliction of the death penalty. So we can't leave the power to decide about how these things get used with the state. That's why you had parliament, but we are finding that parliament can't act on some of these things. So in these individual cases, I think it's important to allow a victim to have a representative who will make the decision about sanction. I think sanction has to go out of the hand of the state. Otherwise, I wouldn't say victims should have a say everywhere, because fair trial standards have to be maintained very carefully. They should not be, because otherwise we've seen in the Innocence Project in the US how many people were wrongly charged because mistakes happened with the accused, and the number of cases where confessions resulted in ultimate acquittal. And then you ask, so why did you confess if you couldn't even have known about this? And they say it was a process of interrogation that psychologically prodded them to make the confession. So we need an outsider to this system to be able to participate in a process which will decide how justice will come, not to be the prosecutor or but in the sanction giving process. I think you need a representative. It's a thought that I have. Maybe when I develop it, I'll drop the idea. But I think we need many thoughts like this, and then we can end up where we want to end up. But it's the beginning of a conversation.
Thank you, Usha. Veena, if there is any thought, any advice in one line that you have for us before we part today.
Sorry, who are you asking?
You, if you have
I just think you know that what Usha said on this, to say, let's not be scared of thinking that this is not a fully formed thought, right? Let's put out various ways in which we can think about these things. And I really admire the work which is being done. I think Uma Chakravarti is doing this with videos. Some people are doing it with writing. Some people are doing it with poetry. Some people are fighting in courts of law. And I think that this range of expressions is really, really important to make something like these injustices something which people do as much work on. You know, I was just thinking of Poonam Khakkar's poem, you know, when she says, "Himmat ho to aake bolo mera sahib nanga," right? And what really offended Modi was saying, "Vare billa, vare ranga," right? And that is, I think, what has to come up with regard to torture, with regard to the way, and as Usha said, it's not just, oh, yes, the Muslims are targeted, but so are women, right? Then the kind of torture that is being done on the name of honor and so on and so forth. So that's my thought. I want to thank everybody really for the amazing work you all are doing. And I just have to say, I'm really just somebody who learns from that. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you, everybody. Now we part and we meet again. Thank you.